Good evening, and welcome to the Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. We're delighted that you could join us tonight. I think we're going to have a fascinating night. Tonight's discussion topic is on the sources, the causes, and the potential solutions to rising income and wealth inequality. It's a critical issue that has received an increasing amount of attention over the last year, basically. Recently, French economist Thomas Piketty wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century, which garnered much attention and ignited more debate on this topic than we'd had previously. Piketty argues that wealth will inevitably become more concentrated under capitalism and proposes taxes on higher income individuals and a wealth tax, a global wealth tax, to deal with this issue. The Baker Institute's Tax and Expenditure Policy Program is delighted to host two renowned economists to discuss these issues. J. Bradford DeLong is professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He held the John M. Olin Fellowship at the National Bureau of Economic Research and is a research associate with NBER. He's a blogger for the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, where he recently moved his popular and influential blog, Grasping Reality. From 1993 to 1995, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department and the Office of Economic Policy. Our second speaker, R. Glenn Hubbard, is Dean of the Columbia Business School and the Russell L. Carson Professor of Finance and Economics. He also held the John M. Olin Fellowship at NBER and remains affiliated with NBER's research programs. From 1991 to 1993, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department. From 2001 to 2003, he served as the 20th chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. He also chaired the Economic Policy Committee of the OECD, and he's the author of two leading textbooks, one of which I use for Econ 201 here at Rice. Our moderator tonight is our own George R. Zodro. He's the Alan R. and Gladys M. Klein Chair of Economics at Rice University, a Baker Institute Rice faculty scholar. He holds an appointment as an International Research Fellow at the Center for Business Taxation at Oxford University, and he's a recent recipient of the 2009 Stephen D. Gold Award presented by the National Tax Association for significant contributions to state and local fiscal policy. With those introductions out of the way, let me turn it over to George Zodro.
Okay, thanks very much, John. We certainly appreciate the great turnout, although I think it's probably not that unexpected. This book has simply generated a tremendous amount of interest. It's not very often that a book by an economist is the #1 seller on Amazon and on the New York Times bestseller list for nonfiction for 22 straight weeks. So I think we're all a little bit envious of Mr. Piketty, to say the least. But income inequality and income mobility are clearly topics that are central to the social fabric of our country and to our understanding of ourselves as a land of opportunity. So it's not surprising that there is so much interest. Moreover, if you look at the many commentaries that we've seen, there's just a tremendous amount of difficulty from an economic perspective in understanding these issues. But there's really no one better, as far as I can tell, than our two guests to address these issues. And so what we'd like to do is begin that process right now. The ground rules are very simple. Each speaker will have about 30 minutes or so for the presentation, and then we'll have perhaps 20 minutes or so from questions from the floor. So our first speaker is Brad DeLong.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be here if only because I get to Texas rarely. That is, it's a state where I have a remarkably small number of relatives. When the DeLongs got to Wichita, they decided to turn north rather than south and wound up in the snows of DeKalb County, Illinois, rather than down here near the Gulf. And those few of my relatives who did get down here, well, my cousin Michelle DeLong Lambana decamped to North Carolina 8 years ago, leaving me with no close relatives anywhere in the state of Texas until last year when my cousin Annie with her doctor husband and their brand new baby moved, but they moved not here, they moved to Dallas. The last time, in fact, I was in Texas for any extended period of time was on my wife's and my honeymoon back in 1986. We were supposed to come to Houston, but we didn't. Our campsite in a swamp near the Louisiana border was washed out by a midnight, mid-June thunderstorm. And so we got up and started driving and bypassed Houston. But then we spent a wonderful week and a half going Austin, San Antonio, Permian Basin, El Paso in an unair-conditioned Chevy Citation at the end of June. And so we got the real Texas experience. But we are here today. We are here today because of a book by Thomas Piketty that has so far sold 1.5 million copies. But it'll take me a while to get to the book because there's a bunch of background. Because people are interested in Piketty because of a problem in the American economy that began to emerge at the end of the 1970s. And that problem is one of income stagnation for the middle and working classes of America. Since 1980, our rate of productivity growth in the United States has been little more than half what it was before. The doubling of living standards every generation that Americans had gotten used to hasn't happened, even though productivity, the dark blue line up there, has kept growing. It hasn't kept up to its pre-1980 pace. And in fact, standards of living at the median, with half the workers above and half the workers below, pretty much stopped growing around 1980 and are still stuck there. Now, you can and probably should paint a more optimistic picture of what's going on with the slots in the income distribution that are average in America than graphs like this tend to show. For one thing, women are much better off now than they were back in 1980 with the decline in discrimination. If, that is, they can find work burdens both outside and inside the household fairly shared. African Americans are much, much better off with the decline in discrimination, although the overwhelming proportion of our African American population has been caught up in the other rising inequality trends. Our standard indices of what prices really are biased upwards by a little bit because they are price indices rather than cost of living indices. And the value each of us receives from what we buy, it's greater than its price. After all, if it isn't worth more to it than it costs, we wouldn't buy it. And this is particularly true when we're buying information goods. And as our economy has shifted in the information age, we buy more of them. And so the gap between what the value of what we produce is to us and what the government statisticians recorded at its price has been growing. Nevertheless, 2/5 of the measured productivity growth we reasonably expected to have seen since 1980 here in America, it's simply not there. And perhaps not all, but nearly all of the growth in measured living standards for the middle of the population that we would reasonably in the 1970s have expected to see by now. That's simply not there, and that's a huge problem. At least that's a huge problem if you believe in American exceptionalism and American progress. So why has productivity growth gone so much worse than previous generations? That's not a topic for tonight. If Glenn and I were to start at that, we'd never get anywhere else, and that's not what they asked us here for. What they've asked us here for is why has the median done so much worse than the average since the 1970s? And arithmetically, the reason is that the top 10% is now getting a lot more, right, than it used to get. That the top 10% of the population used to get about 34% of all income. Now it receives 50% of all income. The reduction in the share gotten by the bottom 90% of the population from 2/3 to 1/2, that accounts for the bulk of the wedge between average productivity growth and middle-class standards of living. And it's landed us in a world in which incomes for those slots in the income distribution that are in the bottom 9/10 have been little better than stagnant. Incomes for the upper middle class, say people in the 90 to 95th percentiles, those richer than 90 out of every 100 Americans and poorer than 5, have been growing at about the same rate as productivity. The lower upper class, the people below the 1% that we talk about so much, their incomes have been doing quite well. They've been growing at productivity plus 1% per year. And the top 1%, well, for them, the years since 1980 have been glorious. Right? They haven't seen any of the productivity slowdown the rest of the country has in their incomes. Their incomes have grown at productivity plus 3% per year. And that's what's carried the top 1% from receiving 8% of all the income in the economy back in the mid-1970s, moved the top 1% from having 8 times the income of the average American to the 20 times the income of the average American that the top 1% has now. And you can look at the top 0.01%. Back in the 1970s, the top 0.01% had 1%, received 1% of all the income, that they were 100 times as well off in terms of income as the average American. Now it's 500. And this is only 260 households in Houston, right? And only 1,300 households now in Houston will ever see themselves being in the top 0.01% of the nation's income distribution. And yet this group that used to receive 1%, for them the past 30 years have been an unbelievable absolute bonanza. Right? The average income of those 13,000 households nationwide, those 260 households in Houston, it's $50 million a year. And back in the late 1970s, their then counterparts averaged $6 million a year. There's been this great hollowing out, right, in the income distribution, and there's been this enormous surge up at the top. That's what's happened. Now, why has this happened? 15 years ago, when we talked about rising inequality, we thought we had it nailed. We talked about the decision in the 1970s to stop increasing relative spending on public higher education. We talked about how those Americans born in 1950 had about as much education as those born in 1960, that the steadily upward march by which each group of Americans, the later you were born, the higher your average education got, how that came to an end, and about how after 1980, technology had kept advancing and kept creating more high-skill jobs and removing more low-skill jobs. And so as a result, as we began to lose the race with technology in our educational system, the college graduates and the well-trained found themselves in a seller's market, and others found themselves in a buyer's market. And so the incomes of the relatively well-skilled and well-educated rose, and the incomes of those who did not go to college fell. Add on to that globalization, plus something very weird going on at the very top, and we thought we had a handle on it, but we didn't. The lion's share of the gains are being distributed not in proportion to education or skill, but simply to those at the top and those at the top. So now we have a situation in which the hypotheses that pretty much all economists thought accounted for what was going on 15 years ago don't really seem to anymore. And so the assembled economists of America have spread out, each pursuing their favorite hypothesis, none of which I think has so far been completely convincing. My old teacher, Larry Summers, likes to muse on how George Eastman and Steve Jobs were both master technologist entrepreneurs, but one's inventions supported middle-class prosperity in Rochester for the whole population for decades, while the others created a few Silicon Valley millionaires. Some point to the decline of the union movement, It used to be that overpaying your executives handed the UAW and other unions a very powerful organizing tool. Hence, George Romney, president of American Motors, lived in a normal house albeit in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, and collected a salary that was not completely out of line given other salaries that he was paying to his unionized workers, whereas Mitt Romney in Bain Capital wound up with a net worth north of $500 million. Both very skilled, both very effective. Rewards for what they did, managing American Motors versus managing Bain Capital, very, very different. I tend to focus on the rise of finance, from 3% to 8% of total income since the 1950s. And yet, does the increase in the share of incomes received reflect anything more that modern high finance is much better at convincing individual investors and trustees of pension funds to take risks they really shouldn't? I tend to focus on the extra 5% of total income we spend on health care that other countries with health care systems that seem to outperform ours do not, and how much of that money flows to those who have gotten legislatures to bar nurse practitioners from offering to treat their patients, or who have figured out the way to really make money in health is to collect insurance premiums and then figure out a way to deny the claims for the treatment of sick people, because after all, treating sick people, especially at the hospitals around here, is very expensive. I tend to focus how with falling marginal tax rates and much higher pay levels for financiers, the fact that top executives regard financiers as their peers makes it much, much harder for directors and bosses who are part of the same social network as bosses and immediate reports to hold the line, especially in the interest of shareholders, given our well-known and long-standing flaws of corporate governance, about which I've learned an immense amount over the years from Glenn, off there to the left. And then there are the hypotheses that suggest that rising inequality is relatively benign. There is the focus on high-tech, winner-take-all information goods industries, on the marvelous technologies of the third industrial revolution, and how we need to incentivize their creation. And we need to incentivize the venture capitalists to invest in things that look silly, that probably are silly, but that nevertheless create a great deal of the knowledge base on which Silicon Valley draws. We note that 50 years ago, it would have really raised the quality of life of 3 women to have been able to spend the afternoons hanging out their laundry and gossiping with Oprah Winfrey over the back fence. But in today's world, she managed to talk to not 3 people over the back fence, but to millions over the TV, to turn her skill into a job, and to make $3 billion. All $3 billion of which was earned. Everyone who wound up paying any part of Oprah Winfrey's earnings was very, very happy to do so, and that's a huge net plus. But back at the end of the 1970s, it was promised that we were likely to get better corporate governance and more time and energy devoted to invention and production management, and less to tax avoidance if we lowered tax rates and made the tax system distribute less from rich down to poor. But we lowered tax rates, the productivity growth benefits that were expected. Well, I at least cannot see them in the data, and the people who say they do see them in the data, I credit with a faith greater than those of St. Thomas. And the argument that entrepreneurship can only be spurred by the hope of a few big prizes. Well, you know, when Glenn Hubbard's successor, Greg Mankiw, began talking about the people who had made it big in the new economy who really deserved to be rewarded, he picked J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter, Steven Spielberg with Jurassic Park, Steve Jobs with the iPod, but all of them were incredibly driven. They did what they did not because they expected to become billionaires out of it. They would have done it for 1/100th of what they got. Now, thinking about policies to try to remedy the situation, and it really is a situation, it really is an insult to the promise of America that people in the middle of the American income distribution now work as hard now as their predecessors did back in 1980, that we have all these extra marvelous technologies at our disposal, and yet their real material standards of living are only a little bit better. It's very hard to think about policies to remedy the situation if we do not have a secure diagnosis of the causes of the problem. and we do not have a secure diagnosis of the causes. But I think I can say that making our income tax and our safety net transfer system less progressive, that's not the policy response you should do when the market economy becomes a more unequal place. And then there is Thomas Piketty and the possibility that it is the old America, the America from 1933 to 1979, that was the anomaly. Back before 1880, we had the frontier America, which was fairly close to being a middle-class society for white guys, at least, not Amerindians because we stole their land, not African Americans because we enslaved them, not so much Mexicans because one of the first rules of Western settlement was first you run off all the Mexicans or find a judge to disallow their claims. But for white guys, you could always light out for the frontier. And that made America a much more equal society than those of Europe. But in 1880, the frontier closed, the Gilded Age began. By 1900, 1910, income and wealth inequality in the United States were rapidly approaching those of Britain, France, and Germany, the kind of thing you see on masterpiece classics, Downton Abbey. That changed with the coming of the 20th century. But perhaps that was the normal. Perhaps it's what's going on now, not what is going on now that is so unusual, but what went on in the shadow of the Great Depression and the New Deal that's unusual. And certainly that's what Thomas Piketty thinks. He points out that historically, wealth is nearly always highly concentrated. And for most of the time we've had market economies, agricultural or industrial, the ratio of the value of total wealth in a society to annual income has been about 7. But 2, the era of wars, revolutions, progressive taxes, depressions, social democracy, wartime surtaxes, wartime inflation, financial repression, that era that began in the 1910s and was accelerated in the Great Depression, quickly saw economy-wide wealth to annual income ratios in the North Atlantic fall from about 7 to about 3. And that's the thing that produced an enormous leveling all across all the North Atlantic economies. And now, Piketty claims, it simply looks to him like we are going back to the old pre-World War I pattern. The Belle Epoque, Gilded Age, Downton Abbey, upstairs, downstairs economy. Now, this might be a benefit for the rest of us. After all, if the rich are rich because their ability to compound wealth is undisturbed, they have to invest their wealth in something. If they invest their wealth in useful buildings and productive machines, well, then the rest of us who want to rent those buildings and work in businesses equipped with those machines, we will find that we are in a buyer's market, and even though their wealth will go up, our wages will go up, and their interest rates and dividend yields will go down. And we might even have what John Maynard Keynes once called the euthanization of the rentier, in which a super rich have immense wealth, but because of low rates of profit derive only modest incomes from it, and so are not that salient in terms of what they have to spend, but only in terms of what they can deploy of the enterprises that they can set in motion. It's possible. But Thomas Piketty points out that when we look in history for a negative relationship between wealth stocks in an economy and rates of return on assets, we don't find it. What we seem to find is that societies in which the rich are richer in relative terms appear to be societies in which the political economic system is tuned to protect the profits of the rich as well, to find reasons to lower their taxes, to find reasons why nurse practitioners should not be able to do things without the active supervision of an anesthesiologist, to find reasons why more houses shouldn't be built where my house in Berkeley, California, originally built for workers in a pear orchard, for unmarried workers in a pear orchard, for 6 of them, now sells for about $1.5 million because it's located a mile south of the university and a mile north of the subway, and nobody is building anything else right there, nor will for quite a while, given Berkeley, California's concern for keeping the city, quote, livable, which also means keeping my real estate values high. So perhaps our grandchildren's destiny will be to live in a world once again like that Joan Austen or Honoré de Balzac wrote about. One in which marrying well after choosing the right parents, that those are the best roads to success as the world measures it. And let me stop there and turn it over to Glenn.
It is great to see so many people turn out to talk about economics and books that are this thick in the evening. The Capital in the 21st Century book by Thomas Piketty is truly a tour de force. I don't know how many of you have acquired it or read it. Brad did a great job in giving a lot of the background of the issues tonight. I'm actually going to delve right into the core of what Professor Piketty is recommending. Now, I come to this through several lenses. The first is in my own research. I work in a field of economics mainly that's called public economics, the economics of the public sector, tax policy, and budget policy. And I spent a lot of the early part of my career trying to build models of saving and wealth accumulation. And I remember the day I had an epiphany several years into this research where I realized that I could really replicate very well the saving patterns and wealth accumulation for the vast majority of Americans. Until somebody, I remember at Stanford, raised their hand and said, but wait a minute, the top 1% of wealth holders hold this gigantic share of wealth and you're not doing so well there. So I changed my research to also focus on how the rich get rich, which I'll talk a little bit about tonight. I've also come to this through a policy angle. I think that it's probably safe to say, if any of you know my policy views, they're a little bit different from Professor Piketty's. But I started in tax policy and looking at the question of income mobility. I accidentally waded into a debate into the early 1990s where income mobility had become an issue, much like it is today. And I wondered whether people realized that who is in the top 1% or 10th of a percent or whatever position you have in the income distribution changes over time. So think about it, there's chairs in this room, and it could be that whoever sits in a particular chair on a particular day has an entitlement, but it's different people on different days. So I used the Treasury data that I had at my disposal and did a study of mobility, finding a great deal of mobility in the US economy, which simply earned me from the New York Times the nickname Mr. Top 1%, which my colleagues still throw at me. One of the reasons I suspect that I was asked to move from the economics department to be dean of a business school is I was one of the few economists who studied rich people, which is one of the great advantages, I suppose, of being a dean. Now, the policy debate has changed a lot. Greg Mankiw, Brad already mentioned, has a wonderful blog. It's actually just Brad. I think Greg and Brad are my two favorite blogs. And Greg had a post the other day where he plotted New York Times mentions of the word inequality. And you will see in the past very few years a sharp spike in inequality. A spike you would have to go all the way back to 1866 to see, where of course that discussion was about political inequality in those days. Professor Piketty is clearly riding a wave in that sense. This is a scholarly book with a presentation both over time and over places, although I hope to make the point with you tonight that the policy conclusions, or if we were to borrow from the game of Jeopardy, where if I give you the answer, what was the question, it's going to be hard to figure out. Years ago, when Governor Bush of Texas was campaigning for the president, and I worked with him, we'd go to events where he would mention the things that I was interested in, like cutting marginal tax rates, and the applause was, shall we say, tepid. But when he said, I want to eliminate the death tax, the room lit up. And I said, but Governor Bush, very few of the people in this room are going to actually pay the estate tax or even come close to it. But I think he quite perceptively argued that it's important double taxation and we should go against it. Fast forward to today, where the zeitgeist has shifted dramatically and Professor Piketty is at the center. Now, what is this book about? Because I said I want to dive in and actually talk about the policy with you. The wind-up in the book is that we have seen a dramatic increase in wealth inequality since on or around 1970. The pitch, and Brad already previewed it for you, is a kind of Jane Austen or Downton Abbey story that going forward, because the rate of return on capital will exceed the growth rate of the economy, the rich will simply get richer over time. And the only way to prosper is to be inheritor. And so if the wind-up and the pitch are those two things, what's the umpire's call? Well, in Piketty's world, it's very high wealth taxation. Now, I'm going to suggest to you tonight that this is wrong as a matter of policy, and I'll do so in a few snippets together. One is what I would call the 50 Bill Gateses question. I suspect if I asked all of you, would you like to have 50 more Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, or you pick your favorite entrepreneur in the economy? Unless you're a very unusual audience, you would tell me, yes, indeed you would. But of course, if those individuals were here, we might well have an even more unequal income distribution. I then want to turn to how likely is a Jane Austen future for the United States. And in doing that, I want to talk a little bit about what economists know about why the rich are rich. I'm going to say something that's obvious to people in this room who are in business, that people don't become rich generally in America or anywhere by saving themselves into being rich. They become rich for something else, and I'll talk about what that something else is. And then I want to turn the policy argument actually on its head and argue that if you believe everything in Professor Piketty's book, the right answer, surprisingly, is not a wealth tax, but a consumption tax. So, there we go. So what about this specter of ever-rising wealth inequality? Well, if you look at early reviews of the book, there was the usual discussion that I think might match your own introspection. If you have finite horizons, that is, we don't live forever, people give to charities, thank goodness, I run a significant one, I'm glad for that. People have poor investments. All of these things work to limit the basic wealth accumulation dynamic that Piketty talks about. But if you go deeper, there are bigger problems. The US data, and I'm only going to talk about the United States in my remarks, but we could talk about others later if you like, but the US data in the book are really not that clean for wealth. If you look at unaveraged source data or points beginning at any other date than 1970, you really fail to see much of the sharp positive trend. This comes from recent work by Alan Auerbach, who's a colleague of Brad's at Berkeley. And the big feature, as Brad well articulated for you about the recent decades, is actually a big role for labor income. So most of the very high incomes to which Brad referred are in fact earned incomes. So these are a little bit hard to reconcile with a rentier society. A second big problem here is the use of the word capital and wealth as interchangeable terms. Now, in very simple models that we might use in a textbook, that's okay, and indeed in some very familiar models, if to economists in the room about growth, that would be okay. But in general, capital and wealth are not at all the same thing. And if you look at trends in US wealth data over the period since 1970, a very substantial portion of the growth in the US capital output ratio is accounted for by growth in the quantity and the value of housing. Now, this is a big deal because one of the cores of Professor Piketty's arguments from an economic perspective is that capital and labor are highly substitutable. And I guess I would just ask you, how substitutable are the bricks and mortars of your castle for clicks and mortals in a factory? So while you might imagine plant and equipment and workers being substitutable, a little bit hard to imagine for housing. And wealth taxation itself would be a poor tool for reducing distortions in housing wealth. There are conventional proposals to do that are far more effective, decreasing the mortgage interest deduction or getting rid, as Brad talked about, of the strange land use regulations, both in my hometown and his, would seem to be much more straightforward. So if you look at the data, the screaming picture isn't screaming so much. Now to the core of the argument. I have to give this to Professor Piketty. He has put R minus G in the lexicon. As an economist who's written textbooks, I dream, and I always tell my wife, what if 1 in every 100 kids in China bought my book? How much money would we have? Now, Professor Piketty has lived this dream because, in fact, he has the world thinking about R minus G. So I want to spend a little bit of time, hopefully not boring you, but going into what's R, what's G, and what is this thing called R minus G? So I think we have to mind the steps that he uses and mind the gap. So here's the curious starting point for economists. An expression or a claim that R is greater than G, in econ speak, and I promise I won't do much of it, would be to characterize a dynamically efficient economy. That is not an economy with too much capital. That's an economy where we worry that the capital stock is too small. There is indeed, if you look at cash flow evidence for the US economy, a number of economists, including myself, have actually shown this as a feature, that we don't have enough capital. The second is this determination of R and G at the same time. You can't simply think of the economy as a spreadsheet where I'm allowed to just move one variable here and then look at its relationship with the other variables. All the variables are connected. And if I have a change in the underlying rate of growth in an economy, that's little g in Piketty's terms, that's going to affect both capital accumulation and wealth accumulation that he's studying and R. But here's the save Professor Piketty has. He says, well, I'm going to get around this because I'm going to assume that the substitutability between capital and labor is very, very high. Bottom line, R is constant. So if R is constant, I can do these experiments. There's a small problem with the argument. It's not true. So if you look at a wide range of empirical evidence produced by economists over decades, the notion that there's this very high substitutability of labor and capital is simply not borne by the data. And then, of course, the question is, what the heck is R? Now, that may sound simple, but it's not. So here's the way Professor Piketty starts. He says, well, let's look at returns that people get. And I want to take this in two steps. One is to think about a return, let's say if you all go out and buy stocks. That return has two components to it. One is a risk-free return that you need to be guaranteed an expected value. And another is whatever the premium is for bearing risk. That's why stocks yield a higher return. Now, the problem is when Professor Piketty focuses on non-war, non-depression periods, that's like flipping a coin and counting only the heads. So you're pocketing the risk premium, but not actually bearing the risk. The correct R to use, if you wanted to do this calculation, would be the default risk-free rate of return, and that's been less than G, the growth rate in the economy, for decades in US data. Again, a recent paper presented at the most recent American Economics Association by Alan Auerbach and Kevin Hassett. And then recent work by Daron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson also showed that there's absolutely no link between, in cross-country data, between measures of R minus G calculated from the data and measures of wealth inequality. Now, what's more interesting are above normal returns. And by above normal returns, I mean a return that's greater than what you would expect from the default risk-free return and a return from bearing risk. Acemoglu and Robinson also find if you use actual returns, which would have those above normal returns in them, there's still no relationship between R minus G and wealth inequality. But here the story really gets interesting, because I mentioned to you, we really have to think about how the rich get rich. We need to think about where above normal returns come from and how do they grow. And this is a little harder than Oprah Winfrey, because there's an argument in economics about the economics of superstars, going back to work by Sherwin Rosen several decades ago. And Oprah Winfrey is an example of a superstar. And a superstar is a level effect. So when I change the size of my audience from this room to millions, my compensation goes up. That's a superstar phenomenon. But what Piketty's trying to explain is something different. It's about growth. There's some really interesting work from people who study entrepreneurship about where very high incomes come from. And typically you can think of it as this, that some very clever individuals in a particular industry have an innovation. They have a monopoly or market power on that innovation for a period of time, and then there's entry of some new firm that knocks them off. The history of Silicon Valley is always thus. And what matters in that economy is what little g is. If little g is rapid, then you're going to have more entry. If your little g is low, then you'll have less entry. That kind of work, I think, is very important for figuring out what returns are. Now, what about tax policy? I suppose I should start with just the manifest infeasibility of the global wealth tax idea. First of all, is global coordination feasible? How would it occur? How would one value closely held businesses? How would individuals secure the liquidity to pay the tax? But I don't want to talk about any of that. And that's reasons to think it's not serious politically, but I want to talk about this as an economic issue. I would note that Professor Piketty does think capital is valuable, just not rich people. And so query, if we tax away the wealth of the very well-to-do, who exactly is going to hold that wealth, assuming we think the capital is valuable? Is it funded pensions, decreases in government debt, direct government ownership of the stock market? Those are the kinds of ideas that might do it, but none of that is in Piketty's book. And if there were no such mechanism, then we would have less capital and be worse off. Now, the problem is quite deep in thinking about a wealth tax, because the high elasticity of substitution, the substitutability of capital and labor that Piketty emphasizes, this is a core of his book, is actually inconsistent, as Econ 101 point, with the idea of capital taxation. So if you go to an economist, this is a union card test of you as an economist, and you go to an economist and say, high substitutability capital or labor, is a capital tax a good idea? They will have to tell you no. Now, the better place to start, if you believe the underlying patterns in the book, would be social insurance, to which Brad referred, and ironically, consumption taxation. And here it's maybe worth explaining that if you had a consumption tax, like a value-added tax in Europe, that's the equivalent economically of having a wage tax and a cash flow tax at the same rate. The cash flow tax, of course, hits all wealth. So if you really wanted to hit wealth in a very particular way, the consumption tax, which has other reasons to recommend it, is the right thing to do. Now, the system has actually become much more redistributive over the period that Piketty studies. The idea of redistribution through social insurance has been a significant and growing feature of US policy since the 1930s. And indeed, President Obama has just put out his new budget. Have a look at what we spend on social insurance programs relative to the rest of the budget. These dominate federal finance. And indeed, Gary Burtless at the Brookings Institution has shown that if you tried to look at inequality on this sort of pre-tax, pre-transfer basis, it gives you a very misleading picture than if you had looked at after taxes. Remember, we have a progressive tax system, and after transfers. And indeed, research has shown that consumption shares are actually much more stable, meaning the transfer system is working. Now, why is consumption taxation the better jeopardy answer here? So if the idea that we need a policy reform, what should the jeopardy answer be? Consumption taxes actually get at above normal returns. A lot of people think a consumption tax is a way of forgiving taxes on capital. That's not true. What a consumption tax does is forgive tax on the default risk-free rate of interest. And that is what's relevant for people's saving decisions. Economists obsess over this. But a consumption tax would definitely tax the above normal returns that he wants. Now, why is this interesting? There's been research by many economists, including myself, to suggest, as I mentioned to you earlier, that above normal return assets are concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. Indeed, it is almost impossible to get rich without holding these above normal assets. What are they? If you look at wealth data by households, quote, wealthy people in the United States tend to be active business owners. That is, they're owning a business themselves or large parts of other people's active businesses. These are where above normal returns come from and would certainly be affected by a consumption tax. The wealth tax, by contrast, has all the bad features of discouraging saving, but really won't go after what Professor Piketty wanted. And in fact, the idea of a consumption tax to get at inequality was actually expressed by Nicholas Brady, who is the Secretary of the Treasury in the early 1990s. And for those of you who don't know Mr. Brady, I would hardly call him an anti-capital guy. He was a paragon of wealth and the establishment, but he was even on this consumption tax page. So to borrow from Lenin, the question, what is to be done? First of all, I think as economists, we have to thank anybody who writes a book that this many people read, or as I noted there, at least buy. I hope they're reading it. For the profession, for economists, I think this is a shot across the bow for us to think harder about wealth accumulation by the wealthy, who are different from the rest of us, not simply because they have more money, but they're doing different things. And what's the effect of tax policy on that accumulation? For policy, I would argue two things. One is that we need to refocus attention on consumption taxation, which is a good idea for 100 other reasons. But actually, non-tax approaches are probably even more fruitful. And in that vein, I would include bank secrecy laws and increases in competition and entry and innovation, and subsidies to education and human capital, and steps to reduce the rate of growth of healthcare costs. A year and a half or so ago, I wrote with a gentleman named Tim Kaine a book called Balance, which was a story about how great societies tumble, going back in history to the US. And typically, it is when a group uses the state to redistribute resources to themselves against growth. I think what Professor Piketty has highlighted is a fundamental issue to which I don't know the exact policy answer. I can imagine two types of people in that very top income and wealth group, top 0.1, 0.01, wherever you want to draw the line. One type is the group that I mentioned. So I have evanescent monopoly power. I earn a lot of money. Somebody else comes in with a better mousetrap, and this game goes on, and that's how wealth is created. Another is that it's not a better mousetrap that I have, but the use of the state to redistribute to myself. Think of it as crony capitalism, politically connected bankers, whatever you'd like to call it. It's very difficult as a policy matter using tax policy to discriminate between those two types of individuals. A better way to do it would be to focus, as I said, on things like bank secrecy and competition. So if you go back to Greg Mankiw's plot that I mentioned, this issue, the issue of inequality, clearly now resonates. And I would argue this is only the beginning. as we go into the 2016 presidential campaign season, we will hear proposals from both sides of the aisle on growth and inclusion, and high wealth taxation, I would argue, just won't be the answer. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Certainly enjoyed your comments. What I'd like to do now, I have to say that this is the first time I've ever moderated a panel where everyone finished way ahead of time. So I certainly appreciate that. We have lots of time for questions. So what I would ask you to do is come to the microphone, keep your questions relatively short so many can participate. And I will take the liberty of asking the first question, which I'll ask of Glenn, because I have some interest in the proposal that he has been discussing. People, economists in particular, have a long time been advocating consumption taxation. But if you look at the formal proposals that have been made going back to the 1984 Treasury One report, to the 2005 Presidential Tax Reform Panel, and even to the very recent Merlis review in the UK, all of those proposals explicitly refuse to recommend the replacement of an income tax with a direct consumption tax, largely on distributional grounds. So my question is, do you think that it's possible to put together a proposal that will be politically feasible? And in particular, do you think that such a proposal should have progressive marginal rates? If it does, how high should the top rate be? And going back to the debates that were surrounding this issue back in '86, should transfers of wealth be treated as taxable consumption?
A lot of great questions in that. I would say that there are politically feasible ideas. If you go back and look at Secretary Brady's 1992 remarks, they were exactly what you described. So he had in mind a consumption tax that would replace most of the tax system, but you would have a high-end income tax. Now, under a pure consumption tax, that high-end tax would be on wages, thinking that people who are at the very top, or CEOs, or Oprah Winfrey, or people like that with very high earned incomes. And you could get progressivity for folks at the bottom of the income distribution through refundable credits, David Bradford's X-tax idea. So you can definitely do it. I think that the amount of progressivity at the top is obviously a political call, but I think you can definitely do it. As to how to tax inheritances, I do think you could see that as a form of consumption, or perhaps an inheritance tax, not an estate tax, but an inheritance tax at something like a capital gains rate.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Professor Russell Green.
Hi, thank you very much. It's a fantastic set of presentations. My question relates to the turnover of folks at the top, and both of you alluded to it, Professor Hubbard directly and Professor DeLong mentioning how many people in Houston will manage to join that group of 260 folks at the top. And so I was wondering how you think about that. I mean, you both mentioned that earned income is the largest reason why folks wind up at the top in the US. So that might imply that there's a lot of churn. So I was curious to hear how that issue plays into our thinking about wealth, because the Piketty book largely assumes that these are kind of static groups.
Well, first, obviously, the top 1% and the top 0.01% at any one point in time are not going to be the top 1% or the top 0.01% for their entire lives. And so any static snapshot is going to overestimate how much inequality there really is. But on the other hand, when I was a third-year graduate student living in a one-bedroom apartment in Somerville on Somerville Avenue across from a scrap metal plant, I think my wife's and my income that year was $6,000 from the NSF. And if you look thereafter at the rocket upwards, it looks like an enormous amount of upward mobility. And yet, there I was, a seventh generation Harvard graduate, the grandson of a guy who was at that time the richest man in greater Orlando. That low income in your 20s does not really mean that you are in that sense poor in a lifetime sense, or indeed in terms of poor in terms of not having immense resources to draw on. So simply looking at what happens to people as they go through the life cycle, as their incomes rise and as they then fall after retirement, that doesn't get it either. The rules of thumb I seem to carry around in my head after spending some time looking at the income distribution is that, I don't think I'm ever going to get into the top 0.1%, although if Glenn's textbooks do well, they will. But I think my wife and I are going to spend about 15 of the 45 years that we spend in the labor force in the top 1%. And so you should perhaps multiply by something less than 5 in order to figure out how many people will ever experience kind of that standard of income. And of course, consumption's much smoother than income. Glenn?
Yeah, I would add a couple things to that. The work that Raj Chetty and co-authors have done recently is a glass that's literally like mine, half empty or half full. I suppose it could be half full if you said that mobility is no worse in America today than it has been, but I would argue that it's half empty in that for all the money we are investing, or think we are investing as a society, we are not improving. And to me, the real challenge is that. How do we advantage people in the middle to do better? And that's not a story about wealth taxation. Unfortunately, it's a hard, long story about education, about training, about competition policy, about 100 things, but that's what worries me.
So the people you don't pay attention when you're 12 in math, and all of a sudden you find whole immense possibilities of what you might do in the future foreclosed to you, and when they're 12 is going to be able to think about the long-term consequences of not paying attention in math.
Fortunately, I didn't pay attention in math when I was 12, but my possibilities weren't foreclosed. I picked it up later.
Right. Go ahead.
My name is Raj. I'm a former Rice student. Professor Zodro is my professor. So now I teach through Teach for America at a charter school here in Houston. I have a few of my students with me. And like many of my students are from the bottom quintile, and I didn't hear much discussion about upward mobility from the bottom. And I know you all are familiar with the Great Gatsby curve, that is to say the correlation between income inequality and lack of mobility. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how, for my students who work really hard and often that American dream is just a dream, it's not a reality anymore, and what we as a country can do about that.
To me, it starts with investments that we are not making sufficiently in education and training. We have to spend more money as a society on human capital. I didn't mention this in my remarks, although I could have, that if you were to really think about what wealth is, part of it is the kind of wealth that Piketty talks about, but it's also the capitalized value of educations. And those are enormous fractions of wealth. And by not investing sufficiently as we once did as a society in education and training, we're depressing wealth, and we're actually making inequality worse. The problem is, what do you do about it? If you look on both sides of the aisle, you'll have on one side people saying we're wedded to 1930s era labor programs so we don't want to change. And on the other side, people would rather change the conversation entirely, so we're stuck. We need this kind of massive investment.
But at the individual level, to finish a 4-year college is, I suppose, as close to a magic key as there is in America today to options, to getting you options in the future, and to upward mobility. That people who manage to finish 4-year colleges see enormous amounts of upward mobility, and people who don't, simply don't. That That's the kind of Jinshi Chinese Mandarin gatekeeping examination society that we have turned ourselves into.
This is switching topics, but I watch C-SPAN a lot, and this morning they got up and they said, well, the undocumented people in the United States are 14 million. And the question is, if we really do let in the 14 million people that are already here, what's that going to do to income inequality in the future of America?
Well, I think they're already here, so it's already happened, right? It seems to be, or at least Giovanni Perry at UC Davis, who studies this intensively and with as good data as we have. It seems to mean that if we took everyone who is here and has overstayed a visa in one form or another and simply moved them out, we'd find that the incomes of green cards and citizens with limited English skills would go up by about 10%. That the incomes of blue-collar workers, without significant foreign language skills would go up by 5%. And the incomes of blue-collar workers who are native-born English speakers but also fluent in Spanish would go down by 3%. Because simply, even among the set of blue-collar workers in America, there are a lot of people who are more productive if they're bilingual, simply because we have this large labor pool. And of course, there's also the problem that if you move 14 million people, say 10 million of whom are probably working age adults, right, 9.5 million of whom are properly employed, back over the border out of the United States, you've just committed an enormous destruction of global wealth. That is, there's nothing you can do in 10 minutes to increase your expected lifetime earnings by $100,000 other than to crawl through a sewer tunnel underneath the Rio Grande from Ciudad Juarez to El Paso. That the opportunities to being in the United States are that huge, are that great. And it seems to me because those opportunities are so great, because it seems to be so much easier to move the people to where the institutions and the rule of law are good than to move rule of law and institutions to where the people are, that we really owe it to ourselves and to everybody to encourage migration into the United States, because we certainly should be rich enough to be able to figure out how to deal with the consequences it has on inequality in our own country as well.
Yeah, let me give a specific idea on that, because this is the part of the immigration debate that is difficult, because the high-skilled immigration debate should not be hard. 40% of my students are not Americans, and I hope each and every one of them would want to work in this country, because they're wonderful young men and women. So that part of the market, I hope, unfortunately politicians mix them up, but I hope that's easy. What's hard is the question you asked, and I would offer two very specific reforms, one on immigration, one on taxes. On immigration, we could move as a country more like many other countries that put an economic priority on immigration more than a family priority. And so that we're not simply going to be mechanically admitting family members, but more based on economic contribution. On tax policy, I think we need to radically rethink the earned income tax credit. It works. We can make it better. It needs to be more generous for single workers. This is a way of helping to cushion workers whose wages are affected in the ways Brad mentioned.
This is my fault, right? Or at least the fault of a meeting I was in 1993, that taking the expansion of the earned income tax credit for single workers out of the budget was the way we hit our deficit reduction target. And I signed off on that in 1993, saying we'll fix it next year, and we never have.
Thanks very much for a great talk. I came on a quote the other day, I think it was by Nicholas Kristof in the Times, saying that inequality is not the problem, poverty is the problem. And I wonder if, is there something intrinsically corrosive, either economically or culturally, about inequality, yes or no? And if so, what level of it should we tolerate? I don't think anyone's proposing a sort of flat distribution of income here.
It's a great question. I'm surprised Nick Kristof said that. That sounds more like Martin Feldstein than Nick Kristof, but I agree with the sentiment. To me, we should care enormous amounts about poverty and making sure that we give people opportunities. I don't spend a lot of my time thinking about, well, actually I do spend a lot of my time thinking about very rich people because I'm a business school dean, but in general, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about those folks. I don't think Americans traditionally have, and if you go back to the argument I made about what it takes to be rich, if people perceive wealthy people as people who worked harder, had brighter ideas, built a better mousetrap, there's just simply no worry. When people see people getting wealthy from what they perceive as connections, trading on state favors, it's another matter. So I don't think inequality is corrosive in the former economy, but it is in the latter.
Well, I'd say that poverty is by far the bigger problem. But I'd say inequality is still a problem, and I'd say for two reasons. The first is that inherited, right, inequality is a problem. That it's certainly true that my rich grandfather lost most of it in his post-retirement career as a wildcatter in Oklahoma, even though he had a magnificent time and spent 15 years having enormous amounts of fun while it all kind of drained out. But still, there's about $20,000 a year that has now all gone, that has flowed to me over the course of my life, that I've used to spend on various things, that's flowed to me from the work that he did and the money that he earned. In addition to all the benefits from growing up with all my relatives and with in the kind of cultural and family life that he kind of produced and nurtured. Did I really have any right to that $20,000 a year boost to my income? No. Would it have been much better spent if it had been used, say, to fund the earned income tax credit for poor minimum wage single workers in the United States over the past 40 years? Yeah, I have to say yes. So there's one sense that, tweaking the social system so as to boost my level of consumption really shouldn't be a high priority for the country as a whole. And to the extent we have a system of wealth, especially inherited wealth, that does that, and does that without any especially good properties in terms of getting people better incentives, we really should not do that. The second is, and I think this is Piketty's biggest worry, which is that he's a Frenchman, and he generally believes that Paris is the only real city in the world, and France is the only real country in the world, and that in fact France is the model of the model country, and that all other countries are only bad approximations of France. But he looks at the late 19th century, right? France, which is then going through the Industrial Revolution, but which has this enormous inherited upper class that has inherited its wealth in agricultural land, in urban land, and so forth, and belongs to a school of economists and historians who trace the fact that France's economic growth was relatively slow in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, and thus France enters World War II with the same population, but only 1/3 of the industrial production of Germany. To the effect that the rich with their inherited wealth in France tweaked the political system in order to focus first on holding on to their wealth and only second, if at all, at encouraging economic growth in general. That is, we economists tend to love Schumpeterian creative destruction, but people who have inherited wealth in the past, they might be happy with the creative part, but not with the destruction part, because it's their wealth that is destroyed, and they will take political steps to try to keep that from happening.
I would agree with that, but with a caution. We do need to be more vigilant about competition policy, as I said in my remarks, but I guess I'm not so worried about the inheritances in the sense that what I have told both my boys is that the vast bulk of their luck and good fortune is they're Americans. The second luck and good fortune is mom and dad are intelligent and caring people. I grew up with parents exactly like that who had no money. And so I think while inheritances are something that conveys advantage, I'm more worried about the advantage if the state comes into the process, using the state, than simply giving money to kids.
Okay. Let's take 2 more questions. Victor?
Good evening. We live in a globalized society, and capital and wealth is allocated around the globe. So how much do you think the inequality can be explained by the way the current tax system taxes capital and wealth in this scenario? And is consumption tax a solution, and how is actually a solution for this problem?
Well, I think you've asked a great question, and it tees up a discussion of inequality that we haven't talked about tonight. If you look at global, think the whole world is one country, this is a nice story. And it's a nice story because hundreds of millions of Chinese, Indians have become much better off. So the global inequality story isn't the same as the within-country inequality story that people focus on. I don't think tax policy has played a very large role here. And I say this because the marginal tax rate has been as high as 70+% in the US and as low as 28%. We haven't seen the gyrations in equality with that. I do think a consumption tax is a better tax policy. I think it's more efficient, and it would get at some of the wealth elements that Piketty is seeking.
Plus, I mean, I think Thomas Piketty would have written a better book if he'd ever worked for your successor at OTA, for Mark Moreau, is it now? And actually had to think about how one would generally really kind of administer a wealth tax, given how impossible it is for even the wealthy to figure out how wealthy they are if they ever attempt to take it seriously. That if you want to tax wealth, a progressive consumption tax is the way to do it because that's by far the easiest thing to track with the least administrative burden and the thing you can have a prayer of tracking relatively accurately.
Yeah.
I've got a question. I think both of you guys kind of alluded to this, especially with your reference of, do you want 50 more Bill Gates? And that's a very frequent justification for why it is that you want to make it so that people can make lots of money because, you get Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and Henry Ford. But what I've found, and this may be kind of an extreme example, if you look through the Forbes 400 list, you'll actually find, and excluding, heirs and heiresses, you'll actually find that the Bill Gates and Steve Jobs of the world are actually kind of the exception. The rule, and this has been getting bigger and bigger each year, is finance, and specifically things like hedge funds, and new people from that group come in every year, and it's not really clear how socially useful it is, whereas with Microsoft and Apple and Ford and whatnot, that's pretty clear. But more and more, it's people from finance and basically just rubbing money together and pulling out a little chunk for themselves. That's kind of, that's the real source of it.
My father-in-law always used to talk about it as me, a finance guy, but yes, I'm
Well, I guess my question is, does that concern either of you? And if so, what would you do about it?
It does concern me a great deal because I have the same feeling in looking at the Forbes list, although frankly, many more of the people than you suggested are business people. They didn't all invent Microsoft. They may have done things that may seem mundane to you, but they got very rich from doing it. I am worried about how large the finance sector got. And I say that as a macroeconomic policy matter and as a statement about the wealth of some of the people there. I wouldn't worry if it were entrepreneurship. If I invent a new financial instrument or a new way of doing something, to me, that's legitimate entrepreneurship. But I do worry that we had a system in which the state was effectively bearing losses, but the gains were to go to a connected few. The way to get at that, it seems to me, is not tax policy. Because if you use tax policy to do that, you're going to sweep in all the business people in that list. To me, it's about competition policy, making sure that there are no rents in these industries, and these industries do lack competition.
Well, I would say that I worry about it a great deal, and even more than Glenn does, and that I worry even about people who invent financial instruments. In fact, perhaps especially about people who invent financial instruments, especially after 2007 and 2008. But I find myself largely at sea because finance and why our financial sector has gone from 3 to 8% of total income over the past 50 years, and why so very few investors take the lesson of Finance 1 about their investments, which is that basically, when I go to Starbucks and buy a cup of coffee, I have money, and the $2.95 I have gives me a lot less satisfaction with whatever I'll buy with it if I don't buy a cup of coffee now. Right? Buying a cup of coffee for me for $2.95 is a win. And selling a cup of coffee for $2.95 for the people working behind Starbucks is a win too. If only because if they drank all the coffee they have back there, they would die. Yeah. Right? Coffee is poisonous in as large doses as those large vats back there. And so it's easy to see why this is a win-win transaction. Whenever you buy and sell a financial asset, what you're doing is you're trading pools of money. And money is about as useful to everyone. There's no special situation in which this pile of money is really worth a lot more to me than it is to you, and so I should be willing to pay you a price that you regard as a good deal, and it's also a good deal for me in terms of money now. And there are small exceptions to that. People with genuine liquidity needs, shaping your lifetime consumption profile, properly diversifying and buying insurance, properly aligning incentives, and so forth. But unless you have one of those very small and not too common reasons for trading a financial asset, what you should do is simply sit tight. Because if you're willing to sell at this price, the fact that someone else is willing to buy, someone else who's probably a professional and may well be smarter than you, shows that it's not such a good deal for you. And the fact that there's so much trading in financial markets that never asks the American question, if this is such a good deal for you, why aren't you taking it for yourself? Disturbs me greatly about going from 3% to 8% of income in finance, especially since I think that the value added by the gambling industry in Las Vegas and the national income and product accounts is simply the net gambling losses of the gamblers. Right? If the gamblers lose twice as much, Las Vegas enters the national income and product accounts as twice as productive. That said, how to fix this? One of the reasons for the end of Glass-Steagall deregulation initiative I was part of at the Treasury in the late 1990s was simply a belief that the way the Securities Exchange Commission and Glass-Steagall had grown forward, we had created a nice little cozy oligopoly in which only a few investment banks knew how to work the system, and so Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, Lehman Brothers, and a few others effectively formed a cartel and reaped utterly ungodly profits. And no one else could compete because no one else had either their reputation or their deep pockets. But that if we got rid of Glass-Steagall and said that other organizations could enter this business, well, all of a sudden, Travelers Insurance would want a bunch of those profits. All of a sudden, Bank of America would want a bunch of those profits. All of a sudden, the old kind of JP Morgan Bank would want a bunch of these profits. What would happen, we thought, with the end of Glass-Steagall was we'd see fees and profits in investment banking go way, way down as this sector of the economy was subject to much stronger competition as the gates were open. And so there was, I forget who the House sponsor was on the Graham. Well, Senator Graham did his will, and President Clinton signed it, and we looked back, and we looked forward to seeing investment banking profits decline and the investment banking sector shrink and better capital allocation and less money going to financiers. And we're completely and totally wrong. Completely and utterly wrong. The fact that there were more institutions in that business seemed to create more excitement, more buzz, more people willing to go and work in Wall Street, bigger fees, the entire growth of the hedge fund industry, paying people sums to manage your money that I still do not see how anyone can think they're a good idea. That yes, there's something very wrong in that sector of the economy, but the attempt of the Clinton Treasury and of Senator Graham to try to fix it to some degree seems to have blown up in our face, and we're still not sure why.
Okay. Well, let me close with just two final points. The first is a bit of an advertisement. John and I edit the National Tax Journal. The two papers that you've heard presented in part today, as well as a paper by Joseph Stiglitz and a response from Thomas Piketty, will appear in the June issue of the National Tax Journal. So I encourage you to take a look at that. You can get information about that at ntj.rice.edu.
Do I get to respond to Joe's paper too?
I'm
Joe
afraid it's only one round.
Okay.
All right.
And the second point is, as a good Texan, we of course could not let our guests from the East Coast and the West Coast go home empty-handed. So I looked into buying them some black alligator belly cowboy boots.
Nice.
Oh, excellent.
Nice.
Well, at $13,000, those seemed...
no, but this is about inequality. Right?
This is the right conference to do it, right? Unfortunately, John tells me the Baker Institute would not spring for the 13K.
Okay.
But fortunately, MIT Press recently published a book by John and myself called Pathways to Fiscal Reform, and so we would like to, as a small token of our appreciation, give you copies of that book.
Thank you.
There we go. All right, thank you very much, and hope to see you at our next event.